Well, welcome to Biola. Thanks a ton for coming. One of the things I wanted to do at the outset was just have you tell a little bit of the story about the transition that you had from being part of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and for, 8 or 9 years of good season you were leading that. You've transitioned first to Christianity Today in the Public Theology Project, then the editor-in-chief. And I want you to talk just a little bit about that transition. How's and why's, and kind of what's your vision for where that's going?
Well, the hows and whys would take a long time, but the vision that I have really started as a teenager at a time when Christianity Today served as sort of a radio-free Bible Belt for me in looking out and seeing a bigger, broader kingdom of God with figures such as J.I. Packer and Philip Yancey and Chuck Colson and others. So in many ways, Christianity Today and C.S. Lewis were tributaries out into the broader body of Christ. And my greatest concern right now is for young people who are watching and overhearing what's happening in the name of Jesus Christ. And so I think that's the major part of my agenda over the next few years.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting to have had that kind of heritage of blessing from the magazine in your own growing up. I had no idea of that part of it. And how does it feel to suddenly be a journalist, so to speak?
Well, I don't really think I'm a journalist. I think I'm basically doing the same thing I've always been doing, just in a different place. But yeah.
Well, good. Well, one of the things that intrigues me in our, I can't remember exactly how we titled this, but it dealt with the issue of contending for truth in a contentious culture or something of that nature. One of the worries that I think a lot of people have had is that social media has been destructive to our ability to find truth in public discourse. So we have traditionally had edited sources of news that is held to a certain kind of a standard. That has been, it seems like, largely replaced, and there's a lot of print media that is kind of feeling threatened for their life. And at the same time, I worry that we have lost something enormously valuable when we lost the kind of journalism that we've had, for all of its mixed qualities, that we've lost something when we don't have people who are actually pursuing the truth and in some sense held accountable to that. So I'm kind of excited about that in terms of what Christianity Today can offer, but how do you see that? And then also, what are the challenges that you find for conveying truth kind of in the public square?
Well, I think the issue is less about the quantity of information coming through social media and more about the way that social media works psychologically. So there are, I was talking not long ago with a woman who had been working in the tech field for many years, was part of the design of several social media platforms, she was in almost despair because she said the way the algorithms have to work is to find those things that people are going to not only pay attention to, but they're going to linger over and they're going to share. And those things typically are not what provoke awe or wonder, or they're those things that provoke anger. That's what causes you to linger, and that's what causes you to share. So you have this activation of the national lizard brain taking place all at once. And then you add to that the way that social media is a part of a driver that has turned everything into middle school in American life. With all of I've had to say we have 5 sons, every one of them, I've had to say at some point in their lives there are some people who are nostalgic for high school, some people nostalgic for their college days. Nobody's nostalgic for middle school. It's hard for everybody, and one of the reasons it is because so much of it is about this insecurity of wondering what do people think of me. So we're now in a time just technologically where that is expanded in such a way that there's no way to get home from it. and there's no graduation point from it. So people are living with all of these little judgment seats around them all of the time, which causes a kind of identity protection. I need to be part of my tribe, whatever that is, and so I need to signal and make sure that they know that I'm part of my tribe, which is really what I think when it comes to misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theories, those sorts of things. I think that's the key issue. It's not so much that false things are being distributed. It's that often those things are being distributed as a way of signaling, I'm really one of you, because I will say what our kind of people say. And then that ultimately makes any sort of claim indistinguishable from another, except in the terms of power. And that's one of the driving factors, I think, of cynicism right now. I had a friend who teaches high school boys Sunday school tell me the hardest thing about it is if there's one jaded, cynical kid who enters the room, he doesn't even have to say anything. It immediately makes any kind of engagement or sincerity seem corny to everyone else, and it inhibits what's taking place. Well, that's really the case everywhere, and there's a suspicion that any claim to actual authenticity and sincerity is just a guise for power. I think that's a very, very dangerous place to be, and there's no, if anything, the environment is changing so quickly. There's no way to really get ahead of some of the ways that technological advances are going to affect people in the church, because when you talk about them ahead of time, it sounds science fiction-y until it's absolutely ubiquitous. And then there's not an easy way out of it. So I'm really concerned about artificial intelligence. I'm concerned about augmented reality, all of these sorts of technologies and what they do to how we see human interaction. And the social media era is a harbinger, I think, of that.
So has our problem with truth, so my PhD's in philosophy, so when I think of truth, I think of philosophy, and I've always felt like I've had a lot of companions, whether they are philosophers or not, who think I'm right when I say that. Yeah. That's what those philosophers do. Doesn't do anybody any good, but that's what they do. Is it a mistake for us at this moment to be thinking about truth, the problems we're having with truth as being philosophical problems because they're actually sociological problems? Is that in effect what's happening? People are not asking, if I believe this, I would increase my quota of true beliefs over false beliefs by 10%. I should believe this. But rather than thinking, if I believe this, I'd lose all my friends.
Yeah, except that I don't think it happens at that conscious of a level.
Right.
I think what happens is people notice, sometimes even at a subconscious level, what do I have to believe in order to belong? Or what do I have to articulate in order to belong? Or what do I have to ignore in order to belong? So often there's George Orwell talked about this with nationalism at the time, having a tendency to not even be aware of what its own side is doing, of the atrocities of its own side.
Wow.
And that's exactly what I think all of us do right now. So often it's not so much that someone is saying, my tribe does this, and so I have to affirm it as good, as that they filter out what will be painful and inconvenient sort of information.
So in the words of the famous prophet Paul Simon, a man sees what he wants to see and disregards the rest.
Right. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you can see that with, for instance, dealing with church sexual abuse cover-ups over the past several years. there are some times when I have seen people gathered together plotting like supervillains in a way in which you think if this were written in a novel, you wouldn't believe the sort of
Too
rhetoric.
hokey.
Yeah. But that's usually not what happens. Usually what happens is that you have people who don't even, it's pre-articulate to think this couldn't happen here, so it must not be that. Or if we deal with this publicly, it's going to give Jesus a bad reputation and hurt the church. And so they turn their eye away and they ignore it. And I think that actually is a danger for all of us, just to filter and to ignore.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm intrigued at a movement that I feel like that has happened culturally. I grew up with my thoughts about Christianity, truth, and our culture as kind of Christians are the people who believe in absolute truth. There's such a thing as absolute right and wrong, absolute truth. We're the advocates of that. The non-Christian world are the people who are the relativists relative to truth. I feel like in 2020, I'm looking around and suddenly everybody's an absolute truthist. We have completely different, mutually incompatible absolute truths. And I used to think, because my sense there's been sort of a fundamentalism sometimes that's risen in the progressive movement that mirrors one that has been present in the conservative movement. But it isn't just even between those groups. Somehow I'm feeling even within churches, I've talked to a lot of pastors in the past couple of years who I feel like they look at their congregation and they have people who are making mutually exclusive, adamant, absolute truth claims. And I guess I'm wondering what's happened to truth, so to speak, in our culture.
Well, I think that's part of the mistake that we made, would be assuming that there are some people who hold to objective truth claims and some people who are relativists, when in reality, almost everybody is holding to very dogmatic objective truth claims, and almost everybody is a relativist at the same time.
Well, that didn't help me at all. Thank you.
At the exact same time. So it's not the division of one group and another. It's just the question of what are the things that you claim as objective and outside of you, and what are the things that you don't. And so I think that's part of where the conflict is, and when the way that's showing up, particularly in churches. I find myself dealing with secular people all the time who assume that the craziness that we often see coming out of evangelical Christianity is driven by pastors. Can't you get these pastors to stop radicalizing their people? And I have to say, the pastors in almost every case are the sanest people around. And what they're dealing with are people in their congregations, and maybe even more influentially, the people who aren't even in their congregations but are in their communities, who shape the sorts of things that take place. And pastors are beleaguered because suddenly they have to not only come in and take people into, as Karl Barth said, the strange new world of the Bible, but they also have to, they have even the people who previously thought, I'm going to avoid all of these distractions. I'm going to obey the scriptures, not to be caught up in arguments about words. Find that doesn't work, because now they're provoking outrage with what they don't talk about, or with what they don't talk about with requisite anger. And so they're in a condition. I was with a group of pastors a few months ago, and one of them said, what was it about 2021 that seemed to break so many of us? And I immediately knew what he was talking about, because I find myself saying often to my wife after getting off of another telephone conversation, can we just space our nervous breakdowns out a little bit? Does everybody have to melt down at all the same time? And And this person said it's 2021, and another pastor in the room said, and the more I've reflected on it, the more I think he's exactly right. 2021 was the year that people started to realize there's not an off-ramp from this. And so up to that point, what people could think is, let's just get through this presidential election, or let's just get through this pandemic, or let's just get through whatever it is. And now they're starting to realize, wait, maybe this is just the new normal. And that's a deeply disorienting reality for a lot of people. And along with that, there was a sort of a magical thinking that many people had, and I include myself as one of them, which is, these things tend to work themselves out. Yeah. And so when there's a big national emergency, September 11th, people rally together and get serious and move on. Well, we had a big national emergency, a big global emergency. It did not make things saner. It had the opposite effect. And so people are starting to realize, wait, when we think about some of these big moments, Pearl Harbor, September 11th, and so forth, those didn't happen in a cultural ecosystem like this one. And if they had, they probably would be quite different. So there's not this moment that suddenly is going to shake us loose from this. And that's one of the reasons why I think many people are disoriented, and some people are giving up in different kinds of ways. There's some people who are giving up by saying, I'm just leaving and walking away from ministry, from the church itself. And there are other people who are giving up by saying, I just have to be a hack. This is just the way that I'm going to be able to do it. And it's easy to, again, at a subconscious level, talk yourself into that. Because what you say is, if you look at Peter Berger's studies of white pastors in the Jim Crow South, and how they talked themselves into, including the ones who knew better, how they talked themselves into not speaking to the obvious issue all around them. And it was something like this. I've got to maintain my seat at the table. I've got to maintain influence. I've got to conserve that influence. If I speak to this now, I'm just going to be gone and I'm going to be replaced by somebody worse. So you start to do that. There's never a moment at which one says, okay, now all of the influence that I've conserved can be expended without cost. Never, the moment never happens. And so there are some people who simply give up by saying, I'll just be whoever people need me to be.
That's a powerful and difficult message. Let me ask you a question about this. So one of my anxieties is that we often look for solutions for what would be, you kind of ask, what would Jesus do, to put it that way? Mm-hmm. And for a lot of things, the answer, well, Jesus would do a miracle and then the problem wouldn't be there. But that isn't super helpful for guiding Rick, who doesn't really do miracles that well. So I have my new favorite saying is WWBB, which is what would be better? What's something we could do that would be a little bit better? Let me ask you that question. Kind of, you have three interesting areas of expertise. You've spent a long time deeply invested in American evangelical churches, so you are a churchman in that sense. You spent a long time in the academy, so you're deeply invested in the academic world, and now you are living very much in the media world. I wonder if you could just do a little thinking about what would be better in each of those areas, something we might do that would just be a movement in the right direction.
Well, I think part of the problem is the question. Because I think of Wendell Berry years ago was speaking to a group of environmental activists, and he said, your problem is that you think that large-scale solutions require large-scale, or large-scale problems require large-scale solutions, and that's rarely the case. Usually, large-scale problems require many very small-scale solutions, and I think that is definitely the case here. Which is that the 90% probably of the answer here is being aware of what's happening. So that, as Jesus says to the disciples, beware the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod. That statement doesn't make a lot of sense because Herod and the Pharisees were opposed to each other. But what was he saying? He wasn't saying beware Herod and the Pharisees. He said, beware the yeast of Herod and the Pharisees. Yeah. Beware becoming like them in ways that you don't recognize. And so I think having the awareness of the kind of world that we're in right now and the kind of moment that we're in right now, and having a longer-term view of the future than what is immediate is what is necessary. And so there are all kinds of ways that we can have a church or have an evangelical Christian movement that is relatively untroubled and will sacrifice the next generation of people who are looking and saying, do they really believe this or do they not? Yeah. And so having a longer-term vision and view. And then finally, I think a key part of this, you mentioned what would Jesus do? I think the real question here is how did Jesus do it? Which is with a kind of confident tranquility so that you see the way that there are moments. I was just telling a couple folks this morning, whenever I hear someone mention Jesus and the money changers in the temple, I tend to back slowly out of the room because it's usually the same thing as what people are usually doing when they quote, "Judge not lest you be judged," which is, let me sin the way I want to. And Jesus turned over the tables, therefore my pugilism is fine. What's remarkable is you have those moments of anger and you have those moments of anguish. Mm-hmm. They are all happening at times when no one else is anguished or angry. The money changers are always there. Fig trees never yield fruit in season. In the garden, the disciples are asleep. The times when the disciples are panicked and anguished and anxious, Jesus is preternaturally calm. He's sweating blood in the garden when there's nobody there, but when they come to arrest him, there is complete calmness in the face, not only of them, but of Pilate. And part of what I think we have to have is the kind of confidence in the gospel and the kind of confidence in the judgment seat of Christ that levels that anxiety back, because it manifests itself in different ways with different people. So you have some Christians who the anxiety is so high that what they're saying is, what do I need to be for you that you won't be mad at me, to whoever it is they're talking to. There's another kind of Christian for whom the anxiety means desperate times call for desperate measures, and therefore I'm lashing out in anger. It's all coming from the same place. It's just manifesting itself in different personality types. A refusal to play that game, to recognize the game and to refuse to play it, is key. I mean, when John says Jesus, knowing that he had come from the Father and that he would return to the Father. I mean, if we have confidence knowing who we are and actually what our mission is, that is more important than whether we come up with a new curriculum or a new program or so. I was telling Dr. Corey this morning, I was at a gathering of evangelicals and someone asked this thought experiment, which is to say, if you were to go back in time 50 years with $1.5 billion and you could put it in whatever ministry you wanted, where would you invest that money? People were going back and forth talking about this. And the more I thought of it, I heard someone stand up and say, I don't think the issue would be the money, she said. I think the issue would be the knowledge. You would have 50 years of knowing what's happening. And I said, actually, I don't even think it's the knowledge. I think it's just the very presence of someone who's coming from the future to say, the gospel's fine, church is fine, is itself powerful. And then I checked myself by saying, someone has come from the future to tell us that the gospel is fine and the church is fine. And I think that's what we have to be reminding ourselves consistently and modeling.
Yeah, it seems like big fears make for a small God.
Yeah.
Experientially for us.
Yeah.
And I do worry about that.
Yeah.
I was recently reading a thing from Barna talking about hope. Well, talking about people's Christian self-perception and then the non-Christian world's perception of Christians. So they did things like, are you a caring person? 60% of Christians answered yes. 8% of non-Christians perceived Christians as being caring. That was a little distressing. The one that I found most intriguing was actually hope, where 55% of Christians said they were hopeful, and only 5% of non-Christians looking at us found us to be hopeful. And I wondered, how did we lose our hope? And perhaps some of this is this issue of suddenly having our fears and our problems seem enormous, Jesus seeming small, God seeming small, and so we panic. And like you say, if someone could come from the future 50 years from now, come back and say, guys, it'll be okay. We might behave real differently in the here and now.
Well, I mean, someone just, I'm trying to think of who even made this point recently, to say, look at, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic. What it did was to give us an experience that we all lived through together, so there was no escape from it, and in which we were isolated and disconnected from one another at the same time. That's not really of a different kind than everything else that we're facing. It's just a concentrated amount of it. And so that's part of it, is that everything seems immediate and universal in ways that ratchet the fear level up. And you're at a time when connections are so tenuous, and so transactional. And this is one thing that the church actually can do. And the churches that I see that are doing this the best are churches who have no idea that they're doing it, because they're understanding what Lewis said about friendship being side by side. Churches that are saying, okay, here's a small group to come together and commune, fellowship. That's perfectly fine for a segment of people. It filters out the people for whom the idea of that is skin-crawlingly awkward. And what ends up happening is the churches that are actually doing this really well are the churches that sometimes just accidentally are finding ways for the mechanic in the congregation to serve in ministry with his or her gifts. And they're serving on mission together. And what comes out of that is fellowship. And that's especially true as life goes on. I mean, I'm one of the most important things in my life is a group of friends. We have a book club. And I told my wife, this isn't a book club. This is a men's fellowship gathering, is basically what this is. But there's no way that we would get together and say, what are you facing in your life? We would just be busy. But when we have the excuse, we're getting together and we're talking about this book, what do we end up doing? That.
You talk about all the other
things. And I think the churches that are making those connections well are the churches that get that. and are doing that. And they look very different from one another. It doesn't take a lot of strategic, self-conscious strategic vision or programming to do it. That's just the way they're operating.
That's great. Well, I'd love to take some time to interact with the audience. It's been great chatting, but there's others who'd probably like to participate. So any questions that you would like to ask Dr. Moore? Dom.
Dr. Moore, thank you very much for coming. It's a pleasure to meet you again in this context. A couple of things that Dr. Langer brought up were your experience within the context of the institution as well as now in media and other. And one thing that wasn't brought up is the topic of ethnic and racial diversity, which I know that you've spoken to in the past. Within these arenas in which you've had a lot of experience, I'd be interested in knowing maybe what your view is on hearing different voices, how that could be carried out well, and the value of hearing different voices. Maybe even some practical tips as to hearing how different people from different backgrounds could also have a voice.
Well, I think I would have a very different answer in 2023 than I would have had in 2015. And not because my views have changed at all, but because it seemed to me in 2015 that what we were seeing was just an awkward generational transition. So you could see God working in all kinds of ways of bringing voices to the table in all of these little flashes of light. And my assumption at the time would have been we just kind of have to get through some of the old patterns before we move into that era. I think one of the things that we all have seen over the past several years is that that's not the case, and that the situation is even more difficult than we thought before because it's not just generational. And so I think the way to overcome that is just to do it and to pay the cost for doing it. So in any given church, especially in any given majority white church, no one is going to take offense at broad, general, non-specific comments about the multi-ethnic nature of the kingdom or of racial reconciliation. No one will object to that at all. When, though, that actually starts to become a reality, when we're asked to bear each other's burdens in real time, and when I can't tell you how many pastors will be crushed because they have people leaving who say, it just doesn't seem to be the same church. It's changing, and they leave. That's a best case scenario. There are other pastors I know who simply standing up, one pastor I can think of in particular, simply standing up and praying for the family of George Floyd meant 6 months of trench warfare over whether or not he's a cultural Marxist. To the point that this man, one of the most confident people I've ever known, said that he would put a hoodie on and was grateful for mask wearing during COVID because he could go into the grocery store with no one knowing who he is. There's not an easy solution to that. You just have to have enough people who are willing to survive it and willing to actually empower those voices and willing to take the cost that comes with it. That is just going to take people committed to it. And usually what happens is that everybody who does ends up giving courage to someone else. And that's what I think we have to do.
Great.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Alan Yeh, School of Intercultural Studies. I want to dovetail on what Dom said in terms of, I loved everything you said about social media, and I completely agree with it, the lizard brain and the middle school and the anger and all of that. But you had mentioned the distinction between how people responded to COVID versus, let's say, Pearl Harbor. Okay, and if I might slightly push back, I would say that Pearl Harbor, while they didn't have social media back then, and you said that the country seemed unified, but I would say not from the perspective of Japanese Americans. So Japanese Americans were put in internment camps. The country seemed unified because the people who would object were not given a voice. So it was a very homogeneous unity. It's not actually diverse unity. And so now, given the fact that social media causes great harm, and I agree with all of that, but there are some good sides to that, in that if social media were available back then, probably those internment camps wouldn't have happened. So what would be your suggestion for how we can have diverse voices who can speak up for the marginalized without having to resort to social media? Or is there a way to use social media effectively so that we can have the positives without the negatives?
Yeah, there's a way to use social media. A, B, there is no alternative but to use social media. So it's not a situation where we can say, okay, the way that we address what's happening in a social media culture is just by not using it. Because even if you aren't using it, everyone around you is, and that's changing you in all sorts of ways. I think what has to happen is a self-conscious use of social media. Social media can do great good in communicating, as you say, things that no one else is seeing at the moment. The problem is right now that gets lost in the noise. Often there are times when you see social media, Breonna Taylor, for instance, nobody would know about that if it had not been for social media. And nothing is accelerating white nationalism and white supremacy among especially young men than social media. So both of those realities are true at once. A lot of this at the personal level, I think, depends upon an adequate awareness of one's own vulnerabilities. So there are some people who should be leading in social media use in that way, and some people who should know themselves well enough not to participate in it at all. In the same way, we need people who are doing evangelism in the bars. We don't send our recovering alcoholics there. We need people who are using social media. We don't need our recovering pugilists there. Or our overly credulous or overly cynical people. So part of that is understanding your own set of both strengths and vulnerabilities. And what's really difficult is training up a generation to have the right kind of skepticism without cynicism. A friend of mine, Yuval Levin, who's written on institutions a lot, said to me a few weeks ago, and I can't stop thinking about it. He says there are a lot of people who assume that cynicism is the opposite of being gullible and naive, when in reality it's just another way of being gullible and naive. So look at, for instance, what's happening at Asbury. There are some people for whom any account of revival anywhere, they're not going to do the hard work of actually looking at it because they automatically, this is great. There are other people who automatically are not looking at it. They don't have to do the hard work because it's automatically ruled out, and they become cynical. That then leaves you without people who are able to test everything, hold fast to what is good. And so training people to have a right sense of skepticism, is this Is this story that I'm receiving actually true? Is there something else that needs to be said? Without having people who simply reduce every claim to illegitimacy or to power dynamics. That's what's really difficult. And that means you have to be sort of constantly pushing from this end and pushing from this end. That's hard, but that's what's necessary.
Others? Joy.
Dr. Moore, thank you so much for being here again and for being the voice crying out in the wilderness for so many of us in the evangelical community who just needed somebody to look to as a leader. And you've paid a really, really big price over the last several years. So one, thank you. Two, higher education, particularly Christian higher education, is at best embattled in the world in which we live. And how would you encourage us to be willing to not be silent and go along to get along, but be willing to pay the price in order that we lead a new generation to the spaces where God is calling us?
Well, when it comes to Christian higher education being embattled, it's really similar to the conversation that I find myself having every day, sometimes back to back, with a pastor and a member of Congress who are both saying the exact same thing, which is, I came into this to do one thing. That's not what is happening now. I just want to leave. Usually what I say to everybody in those categories is I've got good news and I've got bad news. And they're both the same thing. And that is that everybody is going through this. So the good news is you're not in an unusual situation, because a lot of times what people are doing is say, what did we do wrong here? No, that's much bigger than that. The bad news is that means there's not an island of refuge to which to swim. And so every institution, almost every institution and every form of institution right now is embattled. All of those foundations are challenged. So it's not that Christian higher education is uniquely embattled. So what I would say in that case is to live out the calling that God has given to you and make sure that you are congruent, that the interior and the exterior are not different as you're carrying this out. And when that happens, I think one of the things that very few of us really realize is how many people are overhearing and watching to say, do these professors and administrators who are caring for me, do they care for me just as a cog in a machine? Or do they really believe that what they're doing is carrying Caesarea Philippi one step further? That the church is going forward, and every generation of students who show up here are a stewardship to send out. When that is the case, you may find that, well, I keep doing this and it's not having any effect. And it's having tremendous effect with people who are just testing you and watching you from a distance to say, is this real? And what they're looking for is not performance excellence. What they're looking for is, are there people who are really convinced that Jesus has been raised from the dead and are really convinced that we need the best of Christian shaping and formation for the future, so that if tomorrow all of Biola's money went away, if the property was gone and all of the endowments were gone, that there would still be a group of people here saying, we're going to train you, which I think is the case. I think communicating that just is more powerful than you think.
Discover who you're called to be at Biola University, a leading Christ-centered university in Los Angeles, with programs on campus and online. Subscribe for more of our videos and learn more at biola.edu.